The late summer heat pressed against Mia's skin as she stepped into the boutique, a small haven of luxury tucked between the concrete sprawl of the city's downtown. The afternoon sun slanted through tall windows, bathing the racks in a golden haze, while the faint hum of traffic seeped through the walls, horns blaring, tires hissing on asphalt. At 19, Mia carried a restless energy. Her short-cropped hair dyed a defiant shade of auburn, her hazel eyes quick to catch every detail. She moved with purpose, her sneakers scuffing the polished floor, trailed by Lila, her best friend since middle school, whose dark curls bounced with each step, her laughter a bright thread in the store's quiet buzz. Then there was Ethan, her stepfather, a man of 38 whose presence felt like a shadow cast too long, broad-shouldered, his dark hair streaked with early gray, his hands steady as he carried their bags, a reluctant chaperone to their impulsive shopping spree. The changing room beckoned, a narrow alcove draped in heavy velvet, its dimness a stark contrast to the store's glare. Mia slipped inside, the air warm and close, tinged with the lingering scent of jasmine from some unseen diffuser. She shed her t-shirt, the fabric catching briefly on her elbow, and tugged on a dress, black, daringly short, the kind her mother would hate. As she smoothed it over her hips, the curtain rustled, and she glanced up, catching Ethan's reflection in the mirror. He stood just outside, adjusting the fabric with a casual tug, but his eyes met hers, steady, unguarded, a quiet intensity that pinned her in place. Her chest tightened, a sudden heat blooming beneath her ribs, unfamiliar yet insistent. Lila, wrestling with her own top nearby, caught the moment, her lips curling into a knowing smirk as she nudged Mia's arm, her touch light but charged, unraveling the ease they'd always shared. That look lingered in Mia's mind, a thread she couldn't unpick as she fumbled with the dress's zipper, her fingers clumsy against the cool metal. The memory of Ethan's gaze prickled her skin, a sensation she couldn't shake, like the brush of static in the air before a storm. Lila leaned in, her voice low and teasing, suggesting he'd noticed more than the dress, her breath warm against Mia's ear, stirring the fine hairs at her nape. Outside, Ethan shifted, his boots scuffing the floor, and when he passed a different size through the curtain's gap, their fingers grazed, a slow, lingering contact that sent a jolt through her, sharp and unbidden. She stared at her reflection, wide-eyed, the flush creeping up her neck, a silent confession of the turmoil within, curiosity warring with a vague, uneasy thrill. Lila's soft laugh broke the silence, her eyes glinting with something conspiratorial, and Mia felt the ground beneath her shift, their familiar roles bending under the weight of that fleeting touch. The boutique's hum faded as Mia's thoughts spiraled, the city's pulse a distant echo to the chaos blooming inside her. She smoothed the dress again, its hem brushing her thighs, and wondered what Ethan saw, her or something else, something he shouldn't. Lila's presence beside her felt electric, her friend's casual boldness a match to Mia's own restless spark. And when she suggested Ethan join them inside, the words landed like a dare. Mia's heart thudded, a frantic rhythm against her ribs, as Ethan hesitated, his jaw tightening, his silhouette framed by the curtain's edge. He stepped in, the space shrinking under his height, the warm light casting his features in soft relief. Sharp cheekbones, a faint stubble shadowing his chin. Lila twirled, her top barely clinging to her frame, and asked his opinion, her tone laced with provocation, while Mia stood frozen, the zipper still half undone, feeling his gaze trace the exposed curve of her back, her breath hitching in her throat. His voice came low, rough-edged. "You both look incredible," and the words hung there, heavy with something unspoken, a fracture in the restraint he'd always worn like armor. Mia's skin burned under his scrutiny, the air in the changing room growing dense, the velvet walls seeming to pulse with their shared tension. Lila's smirk widened, her foot nudging Mia's again, a silent push toward the edge they were all nearing. The city outside roared on, sirens wailing, voices rising, but in that cramped, mirrored space, time slowed, the boundaries of stepfather, stepdaughter, and friend blurring into something dangerous, intoxicating. Mia's hands clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms, as she felt the pull of it, a current she couldn't resist, drawing them deeper into the unknown. The changing room felt smaller now, the velvet walls pressing in as Mia stood beneath Ethan's gaze, her pulse a wild thing she couldn't tame. The city's clamor, muffled horns, the low growl of engines, filtered through the boutique's walls, a restless heartbeat to match her own. She turned to him, her voice soft but edged with a daring she barely recognized, asking him to fix the zipper that hung stubbornly low on her back. His hands moved, steady yet hesitant, brushing her skin as he tugged the metal upward, each slow inch a quiet test of their fraying restraint. The contact sent a rush through her, warm and unyielding, her breath catching as she felt the weight of his fingers linger, tracing the curve just above her waist. Lila watched, her dark eyes glinting in the mirror, and stepped closer, her arm grazing Ethan's as she bent to adjust Mia's hem, her touch resting on his wrist a moment too long, a silent thread weaving them tighter. Mia's skin hummed where Ethan had been, the sensation lingering like the aftertaste of something forbidden, sharp and sweet. Lila's lips parted, her breath audible in the close air, and the space between them crackled, charged with an audacity none of them could name. Ethan exhaled, a rough sound that betrayed the crack in his composure, his hands hovering near Mia's hips before pulling back, as if testing the edge of a cliff. The mirrors reflected their trio, Ethan's tense frame, Lila's bold stance, Mia caught between them, while the city's neon glow seeped through a high window, painting their shadows in jagged lines across the floor. She felt it then, the boundary they'd crossed, not in words, but in the press of their bodies so near, the air heavy with a need that dared them to leap further into the abyss. The moment stretched, taut and fragile, until Lila broke it, her boldness a spark to Mia's ember. She leaned in, her lips brushing Mia's neck in a gesture that started playful but deepened, a hungry edge to it that made Mia's knees weaken, her eyes snapping to Ethan's in the mirror. He stepped forward, drawn as if by a current, his hand rising to cup her face, his thumb grazing her jaw with a tenderness that belied the storm in his gaze. Then he kissed her, deep, urgent, a collision of want that drowned out the rustle of Lila's top slipping to the floor, the fabric pooling at her feet like a shed skin. Mia's hands found his chest, the cotton of his shirt warm beneath her palms, while Lila's fingers tugged at its hem, peeling it back to reveal the taut lines of his frame, her touch a bridge between them all. Their breaths wove together, sharp and uneven, the sound cutting through the boutique's distant hum, sales chatter, the clink of hangers fading to nothing. Ethan's hands slid to Mia's waist, pulling her closer, the heat of him seeping through the thin dress, a stark contrast to the cool glass at her back. Lila pressed in, her body a soft counterpoint, her hands roaming with a quiet confidence, over Mia's arm, Ethan's shoulder, binding them in a tangle of exploration. Mia's mind reeled, a chaotic swirl of guilt and thrill, the taste of Ethan's kiss lingering on her lips, salty and raw, as Lila's laugh broke through, low and unrestrained, her fingers threading through Mia's hair. The city outside pulsed on, oblivious, its rhythm a steady undercurrent to the chaos unfolding within, their once clear roles, stepfather, stepdaughter, friend, splintering into something new, reckless, and alive. The mirrors caught it all, their reflections a kaleidoscope of motion and shadow, the urban night casting a faint glow that danced across their skin. Mia felt the shift, a fracture in the foundation of what they'd been, as Ethan's grip tightened, his breath hot against her cheek, and Lila's presence wove them into a trinity of need. Her heart thudded, a frantic echo of the traffic beyond, as she leaned into him, her body answering what her mind couldn't yet grasp. The changing room, with its velvet and glass, became a crucible, forging something irreversible. Dangerous, yes, but intoxicating in its pull. The weight of their actions settling into her bones, like the city's endless hum, a sound she'd never unhear. The changing room pulsed with a heat that seemed to breathe, the velvet curtains swaying faintly, trapping the scent of jasmine and the raw edge of their exertion. Mia's senses sharpened, her tongue catching the faint salt of her own lip, her chest rising with quick, uneven breaths as Lila sank to her knees before Ethan. Her friend's fingers moved with a quiet grace, unfastening his jeans, the soft rasp of fabric giving way to his low groan, a sound that sank into Mia's skin, stirring a restless fire beneath her ribs. She watched, her pulse a wild rhythm, as Lila's dark curls brushed Ethan's thigh, her lips parting to take him in, slow and purposeful, her eyes lifting to Mia's with a gleam that felt like an invitation. Mia stepped closer, drawn by the heat radiating from him, her mouth grazing his chest through the cotton, tasting the warmth of his skin as she pressed herself against him, her hands trembling where they rested on his arms. Ethan's voice fractured the silence, a rough whisper, "We shouldn't?" But Mia's response came softer, a plea that unraveled him. "Please!" Her breath warm against his neck as she leaned in. Lila rose, her body brushing Mia's, her fingers trailing along Ethan's side, leaving a path of gooseflesh in their wake, her touch weaving them into a tighter knot. The air thickened with their closeness, the rustle of fabric and the soft hitch of their breaths blending into a cadence that consumed the space. Mia's skin grew slick, her dress clinging where Ethan's hands gripped her waist, his thumbs pressing into the soft hollows above her hips, while Lila's lips hovered near her ear, her exhale a teasing warmth that sent a jolt through Mia's core. The mirrors reflected their tangled forms, shadows pooling at their feet, a silent map of the desire pulling them deeper into this forbidden dance. The tension wound tighter, a thread on the verge of breaking, as Ethan's hands slid lower, lifting Mia with a quiet strength that stole her air. He pressed her against the narrow bench, her legs parting to draw him in, the fabric of her dress riding up as she wrapped around him, feeling the hard lines of his body meld with hers. Lila stayed close, her fingers tracing the curve of Mia's shoulder, then slipping beneath Ethan's shirt to skim the taut plane of his back, her lips finding Mia's in a kiss that was fierce, hungry, tasting of salt and shared need. Ethan's breath grew ragged, hot against Mia's cheek, his movements steady yet urgent, each press of his frame against hers igniting a fire that coiled low in her belly. Mia's hands clutched his shoulders, her nails grazing his skin, leaving faint trails as their rhythm deepened, a collision of want that blurred the edges of who they'd been. Their peak surged through them, a wave that bound them in its crest. Ethan's frame tightening, his groan muffled against her hair, Lila's soft cry blending with Mia's own fractured sound as they surrendered together. The bench pressed cool and firm beneath her, a stark anchor to the heat flooding her veins, her body trembling where it met his, skin flushed and tender from the intensity of their union. Lila's hand rested on Mia's thigh, her touch steady, grounding, as their breaths tangled in the aftermath, warm and uneven against the velvet walls. The mirrors caught every angle, the sheen of exertion on Ethan's brow, the flush staining Mia's chest, Lila's curls clinging to her damp neck, framing a moment that felt raw, transformative. Mia's fingers lingered on Ethan's arm, tracing the muscle beneath, as the weight of their act settled over her, pleasure laced with a pang of something deeper, remaking them in its wake. The air cooled slightly, heavy with the scent of their closeness, as Mia's breath steadied, her body still humming with the echo of their release. Ethan eased back, his hands gentle now, guiding her to the floor, her legs unsteady as they brushed against his. Lila sank beside them, her shoulder pressing into Mia's, her smirk softened by a quiet vulnerability, her fingers threading briefly through Mia's hair. The changing room held them in its dim embrace, The velvet and glass, a silent witness to the fracture they'd forged, their bond reshaped by the heat of their shared surrender. Mia met Ethan's gaze, dark, searching, shadowed by conflict, and felt the intimacy settle into her bones, fragile yet undeniable, a thread of connection that stretched beyond the night, pulling them into a space they couldn't yet define. Morning light filtered through the gauzy curtains of Mia's bedroom, a pale glow that softened the edges of the night's chaos, casting faint patterns across the rumpled sheets. The air hung cool and still, tinged with the lingering warmth of their bodies and the faint musk of sleep, a quiet contrast to the heat that had consumed them hours before. Mia perched on the bed's edge, her auburn hair a wild tangle framing her face, her skin still tender where Ethan's touch had pressed, a subtle ache threading through her frame as she pulled her sleep shirt tighter around her. He stood near the door, his shirt half-buttoned, his broad shoulders tense as he worked the fabric with unsteady hands, his dark eyes darting anywhere but to her. Lila lay sprawled beside her, one arm flung across the pillow, her curls fanning out in a dark halo, her usual smirk softened into something raw, unguarded, her chest rising slow and steady in the dimness. The silence wrapped around them, thick and heavy, broken only by the soft creak of the floor as Mia shifted, her bare feet brushing the cool wood. Her fingers toyed with the hem of her shirt, tracing the worn threads, her mind replaying the night, the press of Ethan's body, the warmth of Lila's kiss, leaving a knot of guilt and longing coiled tight in her chest. She stood, her legs unsteady, and reached for him, her hand grazing his sleeve, the cotton warm from his skin, a tentative bridge across the chasm they'd opened. He froze, his fingers stilled on the last button, and turned to her, his gaze fractured, regret warring with a pull that mirrored the heat still simmering in her veins. "This changes everything, doesn't it?" he said, his voice rough, low, carrying the weight of their shared unraveling, and she nodded, her throat closing around the words she couldn't find. Lila stirred, her body stretching languidly across the bed, her voice threading through the quiet. "Maybe it's just the start." The words landed soft, a whisper of possibility that hung between them, her eyes catching Mia's with a glint of something unspoken, a tether to the night's reckless intimacy. Mia felt it, the echo of their tangled limbs, the press of skin on skin, binding them still, shadows stretching across the wall from the morning light, jagged and restless, a silent echo of the desire that had remade them. She let her hand linger on Ethan's arm, her fingertips tracing the faint pulse beneath his skin, then pulled back, the warmth of him clinging to her as she sank onto the mattress. He hesitated, his frame outlined against the door, the fabric of his shirt pulling tight across his shoulders, then stepped into the hall, the sound of his retreat a dull thud against the stillness. Mia's breath hitched, her chest rising with a slow exhale as she watched him go. The memory of his taste, salt and need, faint on her lips, her body still humming with the night's intensity. Lila rolled onto her side, propping herself on an elbow, her curls spilling over her shoulder as she offered a half smile, her usual bravado tempered by a quiet question in her stare. Mia met her eyes, feeling the weight of their shared act settle deeper, a pact forged in the heat of that velvet-draped space, now fragile in the light of day. The room held them in its soft embrace, the air thick with the scent of their closeness, the sheets still warm where they'd lain. Mia's fingers brushed the pillow beside her, tracing the indent Lila's head had left, and felt the night's chaos linger, a raw, transformative force that had marked them all, leaving her caught between retreat and the pull of what might come next. The quiet deepened, the light shifting as it climbed higher, shadows dancing across the wall in a slow, uneven rhythm. Mia leaned back, her hair fanning across the pillow, her skin prickling with the memory of Ethan's hands, Lila's breath, the way their bodies had woven together in a moment that defied everything she'd known. She glanced at Lila again, their gazes locking in a silent understanding, a thread of intimacy that stretched beyond the night, fragile yet unbroken. The ache in her chest softened, mingling with a strange, unsteady hope as she wondered what lay ahead, whether they'd step back from this fracture or lean into it, their bond reshaped by the fire of that cramped, mirrored space. The shadows shifted once more, a motif of the desires that clung to her, pulling them into a future she couldn't yet see, tender and uncharted in the morning's hush.